Okay, Steve, so yesterday I had the opportunity to sit in your IB Spanish class. In general, how successful do you think the lesson was?
I think it went pretty well. I think it kind of depends on how you define success. If you define it as everybody winding up with all the knowledge and skills that I was hoping they'd have, or hoping they would be able to at this point in the unit be able to demonstrate, then it's, I can tell that there's still work to be done. But if you define success as the kids having an opportunity to gauge the extent to which they know that they've mastered the content, and myself having that same opportunity to gauge whether or not they've mastered the content, then I think by that definition, then it was pretty successful.
So, what happened within the lesson that gave you that information? How do you know that that's what you got out of it?
Well, it wasn't necessarily in the context of, or well, in that specific moment, I didn't have all of the information that I would have needed to know the first part, which is, do they have these skills? But in the moment, I was able to determine a couple things. That for the most part, maybe with one or two exceptions, all the students were engaged in the activity. They were all contributing to, they were working in pairs, so that inherently kind of limits the extent to which you can know what one particular student knows. But you still have a sense of kind of what the contribution level is. But by having an activity where everybody, in order to make the world go round, so to speak, in the activity, everybody had to contribute to a phase of it. And so, in that sense, I think it was successful because I knew that whatever I was getting was based on the units that were coming up with the information, and then I can later go back and isolate, where the issues came up in a given pair of students. There wasn't a lot of students beyond their pairs working with others that would then kind of make it hard for me to guess, okay, well, who knows what. But certainly in terms of opportunities for them to provide information and for me to have information about their ability levels, I think that it was successful.
Good. And just a little feedback on that, because that was one of the things I noticed in working with and watching the groups work. They did a really good job of using each other for things that they didn't know, and they would discuss it. They even kind of went outside their groups once in a while, and the kids that were sitting in the back over there next to me were talking about something, then they asked somebody else, and somebody else turned around, which I thought was great. It showed that they felt very comfortable working together and working through those issues. On the other side, which I don't know how you solve this, but just something to think about, you had an odd number.
Yeah.
And that group of three was the complete opposite from that.
I noticed that myself. They were just, they were chunking it out. Okay, your turn.
Yes.
You do it. Your turn. You do it. And I think that was partly based on that individual group's dynamic. Yeah, another group of three, I think, probably would have approached it like everybody else.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, something to think about, because I was the same way.
I think anyway.
Was it the group, or was it because there was three?
Yeah, based on my experience with a particular student in that group in the past semester, I would say that it was probably unique to her. So.
Gotcha. I know that today you finished up from yesterday's lesson, based on the stuff that you wrote. So, I don't know if you brought examples of student work, or if you've had a chance to look through those. But if you did or have got a chance, what does that reveal about the students' level of engagement and understanding?
Well, what we did today was, so I haven't, in the time that that I've did the follow-up lesson, I haven't had a chance to go through all of the content. So I have a stack of which essentially amounts to a formative assessment on these pairs of students. And then I can go back now and look through it, and I can highlight specific areas that I need to go back and reteach. But what we did do, and I think this is what was most meaningful for the students, was to take these sheets and use a document camera to project them up here on the whiteboard. And then as we went with it projected on the whiteboard, we were able to make some corrections here and there and highlight some other common mistakes that people were making, just in terms of little grammar details associated with the assignment. But the other piece was, even not having looked at this and not having done that activity, just me going around while the activity was happening, I was able to gauge sort of the type and frequency of struggles that students were having, whether it was vocabulary based or, you know, because there were one or two groups where the progress that I would have liked to seen them made based on the grammar stuff was actually being a little bit inhibited based on vocabulary issues, where they were trying to go kind of beyond the scope of the unit vocabulary. Most kids were working with their vocab sheet right there, which was fine, but sometimes when kids get, I don't know if too creative is a bad word, but they want to bring in vocabulary from beyond the unit, and so then they get kind of bogged down in looking up words and stuff like that. But for the most part, I was able to, while just in real time, have a sense of, you know, where people were making mistakes. And the mistakes they were making were ones that you would expect to see in students who are just basically, you know, struggling through learning a concept. And then they were ones that, in the moment, just a slight correction would, you know, get them back to where they needed to be. So.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. I thought you did a really good job of going around the room. And one thing I noticed is a lot of times we see teachers work around the room and they're only addressing when a student raises their hand. I did notice that you did a really good job of being able to correct people as they were working through something. And so I think that was really good that you were able to notice those problems and correct them without them having to, you know, feel like they had to ask the question to get feedback from you.
Yeah, and along with that, one of the things that I anticipated but didn't maybe quite have a solid enough plan to deal with was just this notion that because the next group's content depended on the previous groups, if it was so off that they couldn't then use it for the next thing, then I had, on one or two occasions, I intervened and just made a couple corrections as the papers were being exchanged to the other groups, just so that the next group wouldn't be, wouldn't be prohibited or from, you know, making the right, you know, moving the assignment forward in the way that it was supposed to.
Yeah. Kind of along those lines, comment on classroom procedures, student conduct, your use of the physical space when you had them partnering up. What extent did those contribute to student learning?
Well, the way that I have the room arranged right now isn't necessarily specific to that one activity. Like when I arranged the room a couple weeks ago, I wasn't thinking per se this specific activity, but it did actually happen to be the case that earlier in the week we did a different activity that was more speaking oriented, where the desks were in pairs but facing each other. And it just worked out that my normal for this activity, and actually a lot of activities that we do that are involved with pairs, it just works out to have sort of columns of paired desks for a couple of reasons. A, there's a natural working partner. And then B, the way that the rotation worked of just going straight back, you know, it just kind of makes everything smoother instead of having to sort out where everything goes. It just goes straight back. And then the other piece is the way that the columns of desks are arranged right now is very specifically so that I have space to get to those, you know, groups of students. And it also just happens to be the case that for that period right now, there's a pretty good distribution of students in terms of having complete sets of students to work through, in this case, a 4-stage activity. So.
Yeah. Did you depart from your lesson plan at all during that lesson?
Yeah, I did. And it basically had to do with pacing. My goal was to get through 2 rounds of the activity, and some students finished the first round, but most students stopped short of finishing the first round. And I think at the end of the day, it probably goes back to the time at the beginning of the period, and you know, and I don't think that I necessarily could have done it any differently. I think I just underestimated how long it would take to get through the warm up and the correcting of the previous day's homework. If I were to retweak that, I think probably what I would have done is spread out the instruction a little bit more, so that when I went to introduce the review concept from before, maybe I'd have done that the day before instead of trying to fit it in between the activity and the
Right.
homework review or something, just to even it out a little bit. So yeah, I mean, definitely I knew that it was going to be tight, but you know, sometimes over planning is good in terms of, you know, the pacing, because it's better to have more, probably too much
Right.
content than to come up short. And so,
Sure.
but it worked out really well today. We were at a point where they just sat in the same seats where they finished yesterday, picked her up right where they left off, and we moved into the next one. My only probably regret is that I didn't. That it would have been nice to just have a little bit of closure on the first round that day, instead of trying to have the closure 10 minutes into the next day's lesson. So that, the pacing mostly.
I noticed the pacing issue too, and a couple things. One great thing I saw that I really liked was when the bell rang and students came in and sat down, you were standing up here and you were directing them to the objective and to the warm-up activity. So I thought that really set the tone for learning, that it was right now, here's what I want you to do, here's what we're talking about today. And then they got to work and you were able to go take care of teacher business of take and roll and that kind of thing, and then came back to it. So that I thought was really good. One suggestion I have is, I think there were 3 different times that you gave them a time limit to do, of how long they had to do something. And I noticed this at the beginning in the warm-up. You would say, okay, you have 2 minutes left. And then you went about 3 or 4 minutes, and then you said, okay, 1 minute left.
And it was 2 or 3.
And then it was 2 or 3. And what I noticed when that happened was when you said you got 2 minutes left the very first time, a number of kids made sure they were finishing up, and it kind of put the pressure on them to do it. And then as that went on, there were other kids that were done, and other kids that I could tell from watching them that they didn't care if they got done until you went over it.
Oh, right.
They were waiting either way.
Okay.
And then later on, you were in one round and you said, you did a good job going around checking how much progress they'd made, and then you gave them a set of time to finish, and then again you went over that time. Now, those things happen, but I really like the idea of using the time. You might just want to look at maybe something to remind you that that time is up, if you want to hold them to that. And that would be something you'd want to play with, right? I noticed in your post-observation write-up that this was the first time you'd done that lesson, so.
Yeah. Well, and
Time
actually, when I was totally cognizant of having gone over each of the time limits, and the time limit, when I threw them out there, I threw them out there in the spirit of, we've got to light a little bit of a fire here, because
Right.
we need to move on. But I was sort of making the assumption in my own head that they weren't watching the clock, and that what's 2 minutes for me, or what's 3 minutes for them, might actually seem like 2 minutes. But the point was that I was trying to give them the time limit, but then honoring the fact that not all of the students made it in time, essentially. Sure. But I totally see that point of just kind of trying to be consistent with it. One of the things I've toyed with, and it just, I thought it was maybe going to be a little bit too busy, was using the projected stopwatch. And I actually think I may give that a whirl today, because I'm one day off on my other class that's doing a similar lesson, but just project the stopwatch up on the screen, so that they have a sense of what their time is. Yeah,
and you're right, it might not work for every lesson at every time, but it might be something to look at doing and just play with it and see how it
And the reason I opted not to yesterday partly had to do with the fact that I was anticipating that we would get to the overhead projector review, and I'm not quick enough in my transitions between what's on my computer, the stopwatch, the digital stopwatch, and then having to take it all down and then reconnect the. So I knew things were going to be tight, and then that transition might cause a lot of downtime for the students. But anyway.
Comment on different aspects of your instructional delivery, and to what extent they're effective. And for me, watching this lesson, this is more of you just explaining to me pieces that I might not have gotten, because, right, you're explaining in Spanish parts of it and in English, and I can pick up a little bit of it, but just, just comment on how you felt that went for you.
It wasn't as, I don't think it was probably as, I don't know how to say it, consistent, or, probably consistent's the best word. Like, typically when I'm giving instructions in Spanish, I like to be able to give those instructions and then have the students process the instructions and then get to the activity. And because I knew I was already kind of a little bit under the gun time-wise, I felt like I was kind of doing it maybe not quite as with the same fidelity that I normally would. In other words, I was giving them the instructions and then having to fairly quickly make sure that in English that they knew what the instructions were. So under normal circumstances, Spanish 3B and IB Spanish, I'll be giving them instructions virtually, all in Spanish, and then I'm expecting them to have a second to process. And I just felt like because of the time crunch that affected my ability to honor that cognitive process for them. So, yeah.
So it's good that you're aware of it. Make adjustments. If you had a chance to do this lesson again, same group of students, what would you do differently?
Well, we already talked a little bit about the pacing issue, and I've already done what amounts to the part 2 of that lesson, and then the second day, the pacing aspect. There were a couple of changes that I made that seemed to facilitate the flow of the activity going a little bit better, and that was to give the individual sort of pairings of students a little bit more autonomy on the time issue. Mm-hmm. So what I was allowing them to do was, so if students finished up quick, to just go ahead and pass theirs back, and then that kind of gives an alarm to the people behind them, if they're not, on the same pace. Sure. That, well, okay, we're probably needing to finish ours up now. And then also, it just, because there's such a disparity in terms of pace across the room, it worked in just facilitating individual levels of, achievement and getting things done at a particular time and allowing them to move forward. One of the things, though, that I think that I would approach differently next time, if it's a crazy week and I just didn't have enough time to really set it up in a meaningful way, it would have been really kind of contrived if I'd tried to done it that day, was to put a little bit more thought into the pairings. I had probably 3 or 4 pairings where both students were really strong. Mm-hmm. And so it creates 2 issues. A, they don't, they're in a position where they can pretty much work through it on their own. And so the collaborative piece is not as, the creative collaboration is there, but not so much necessarily. They continue to still bounce ideas off each other, but what it does is it kind of weakens the resource that I have within the room, which is to put stronger students with weaker students and so on and so forth. Just to have, and then also it affects pace. So if you have equal sort of distribution of talent, it's more likely that in an activity where pace is important, that it's going to be a little bit more uniform. So I had probably 2 or 3 groups that were kind of top heavy on talent, and then 2 or 3 groups that were a little, that struggled a little bit. And so, but if I'd had them more evenly distributed, I think it would have improved a little bit.
So last thing, just is there anything else about this lesson or this group of students that you didn't get a chance to talk about or that you feel is important that I should know?
Well, the overall objective of the lesson, I think it was clear, was that what we were trying to have the students do is gauge the extent to which they're able to integrate various structures, grammar structures, into a writing or speaking assignment, and use those in coordination with one another to have this a text that shows a variety of different grammar skills and knowledge and so on. And that the end part of the task hasn't been completed yet. So we've gone through the 2 rounds, and the final task is for them now to take the series of recommendations that were delineated or that were elaborated in different using different grammar structures, and then take that information and synthesize it into a coherent text. And so that's the final step, which for me will be kind of where we close the loop, and so that'll be happening on when we come back from the long weekend. So.
Okay, great. One thing I'd just like to end with is when you were talking about that, in 3 different times throughout that lesson, you explained to the class what the objective of it was, why they were doing this, and you tied it into assessments. One time you made a good point that I think for them was probably really telling, was you used an example of what not to do, and you said that it wasn't completely wrong, but it was a red flag that you're not a native speaker. And so I thought that was really good, that the kids clearly understood what the goal of this was and where they were going with it. And not only that, but why it was important in the grand scheme of things, of using this and applying this knowledge outside of the classroom. So Good job.
Thanks.
Yeah.